All right, I think we are slowly but surely getting a full room. So I think that is a sign to me and our wonderful panelists of today to get started with this panel. So welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this very first panel session as part of the Responsible AI virtual event series of 2025. Today we're going to be talking about essentially everything that's new in the responsible AI space as we head into 2025, looking at what's real, what's next, and what matters. I learned last week that or that it's least commonplace to wish people a happy new year until the end of January. I had no clue that was a thing, so I'm gonna make use of that opportunity to wish everyone a happy new year since we have one week left until the end of January. And welcome and thank you for joining this panel once again. My name is Hela Drukac. I will be your host throughout this panel session. I'm the Director of Policy and Delivery at the Responsible AI Institute. And for this session, I am joined by three incredible panelists. I will introduce each of you with a short line, but then I want to hand it off to you guys to introduce yourself and speak a little bit more to what you do on a day-to-day basis in the responsible AI governance space. So we're joined by Rebecca Evans, Product GTM Lead in the area of data and AI governance at OneTrust, Michael Brent, Director of Responsible AI at Boston Consulting Group, and then finally, Bilva Chandra, AI ethics, safety, and policy expert. A quick note before I hand it off to the three of you. We have both a chat and a Q&A section as part of this Zoom meeting room. Feel free to ask any questions. If there's time left at the end of this session, I will make sure to open up the floor to any questions. In the case that there are any questions that may link to what our panelists are speaking to today, I will open up the floor to that as well. I'll keep my notes there because I think you guys are the more interesting people to talk today. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, maybe starting with you, Michael.
Thank you, Hadassah. Thank you for inviting me and for having me here. Really excited to be here today. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Brent. I'm the director of the Responsible AI team at Boston Consulting Group. I've been here with BCG just about 3 years. I came over from Microsoft. I was in the Office of Responsible AI there. And before Microsoft, I was at a startup standing up a data ethics framework. And before that, I was an academic. I have a PhD in philosophy. I spent many years in academia, and given my background in philosophy and my work in responsible AI, I think I have the greatest job in the world right now. So it's a very exciting place to be, and I'm happy to be here. And I will hand it over to Bex.
Thanks, Michael. Bex Evans, I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at OneTrust, been here for about 3 years. We started in the wake of GDPR. We're the leading provider of privacy management solutions. I've had the opportunity, and Michael, I'll probably go to bat against you with this one, but I think I have the coolest job in the world. I got to bring our AI governance solution to market about 18 months ago. Really excited to work with teams who were maturing their various governance programs into the AI space, work with some of the early adopters, ensure that our product roadmap and strategy fits their long-term goals. And I get to work with product to bring those solutions to market. So it's a really exciting time to be in this space. And I'll pass it over to Bilva.
Awesome. My name is Bilva Chandra. Super excited to be in this panel. I just started. This is day 2 in my role as an AI safety and ethics manager at Google DeepMind. I am on this panel in my personal capacity. My experience in responsible AI and focused more on AI ethics and safety really started a couple of years ago, when I led DALL-E safety, so safety for image generation at OpenAI, kind of right prior to the launch of ChatGPT. And since then, I've been involved in AI policy, safety, and ethics spaces, most recently at the US AI Safety Institute, where I led the portfolio on synthetic content. So lots of different safety use cases around synthetic media. Super excited to be here and talk about operationalization of responsible AI in this new year.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for these introductions. I was going to ask a different question at the end of this session, but I think we may want to focus it on who actually has the best job among the three of us. I think that's worth a discussion in itself. No, all jokes aside, let's get started with this panel. Michael, I'm going to direct this first question to you. It's a broad question. because as always, there's a lot going on in the field of responsible AI, especially when we talk about, operationalization of AI governance, AI principles. The EU AI Act is coming into force. New US administration came into came into place this week as well. So long way to say, a lot going on. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is shifting going into this new year in terms of responsible AI implementation and adoption?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Hadassah. So for 2025, I see two crucial driving factors, both actually stemming from the EU AI Act. So I think we can expect clearer guidelines from the EU and a larger set of requirements for those who are deploying high-risk systems in the EU. I think both of those factors will drive much faster movement to implement RAI globally. So for instance, hopefully we'll see some clarity on best practices regarding key compliance items like algorithmic impact assessments, testing benchmarks for evaluating traditional and Gen AI systems, hopefully some clarity on what a risk management or quality management system is, internal trainings and the AI literacy requirements. As we get more information about what those look like, that I think will finally drive large-scale implementation of RAI practices globally, especially for organizations that see themselves as global and who will be aligning with the EU AI Act for their deployment practices. So that's what I see and hope, and that's my hunch as to what will drive faster implementation of RAI this year.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Michael. And I know we'll be getting deeper into the US scene later as well. But maybe on another note first, Bex, I know that with OneTrust, you help organizations directly through the platform that you've built. I know initially with privacy and data protection as the backbone, and now focusing on, of course, also on AI governance as well, helping them implement AI principles and practices. So what's that looking like, that operational side going into this year?
Yeah, Hadassah, thank you for the question. I think last year was a lot of educating. Our core audience has shifted. The people that we work with has evolved. The committee has grown a lot. One area that was less abstract than it was before was really around awareness and training. Most companies in the last 18 months rolled out some sort of AI policy to promote principles within the adoption of AI. But I think in practice, what we've seen is policies without training. And by that, I really mean like role-specific training, not just high level, is really needed. I often hear the phrase that AI is a team sport. I'm not really sure who to attribute that quote to anymore these days, but I think we can all agree you need a diverse team of stakeholders involved across the AI lifecycle to promote these principles of transparency, fairness, human oversight, risk management, and privacy. Specifically, when we start to bring this party together, I think one particular stakeholder, I'll call them the project owners. So it's anybody who's sponsoring an AI initiative or is responsible for its planning, its design, its business impact. Their job is not their core job function is not understanding the laws, is digesting frameworks. Their core job is to drive value for the business. So they're oftentimes not aware of the definition and the scope of what an AI system is. And to Michael's point, to what implications that has when we think about the impact of a law like the EU AI Act. The OECD has defined what that definition is and what it's anchored on, right? So there's different components in it. I'm not going to, rattle off the definition of it. I'm sure someone on here could, but key points around it are a machine-based system that infers, it takes in inputs and it produces an output. And then there's some characteristics on autonomy and adaptiveness. So it's a really broad, amorphous kind of definition. Now, Gartner has done an excellent job of taking that a step further and codifying some of the different deployment classes. And so we'll see characteristics within that definition come to life. So the first example they provide is the AI in the wild. So it's ChatGPT, using that for drafting product descriptions or customer service responses. So the machine-based system is that web app. You've got the inputs that are the prompts from the user. The outputs are the content. And then they provide different three other categories of embedded AI, so AI that is within different SaaS products that you're using. Hybrid AI is the adoption of maybe a third-party foundation model that is built upon maybe using enterprise proprietary data to fine-tune it. And then there's the more traditional AI in-house. So there's all of these different types of AI deployments that all have different components within them. So for a project sponsor, that's a lot of detailed information that I have to provide and measure and manage. And I'm oftentimes working with developers, data scientists, engineers who don't really cherish filling out assessments. They want to build rocket ships. So I have to find a way to assess these components, evaluate their risk, accept and monitor the risk. According to MIT's risk repository, 65% of the risks that they've identified are post-deployment after a model has been trained. So the work isn't done once we launch it. We have to have those metrics in place. And I just described, like, there's nuance just with the type of system, then there's nuance with the use case. So take, for example, if I'm trying to manage and mitigate the risk of bias, for example, you have to understand the use case, but then you have to pick the right metric. OECD has over 26 different types of fairness metrics within their tools and measures. Feminist AI last counted 21. When I asked ChatGPT this morning, it had 12 different options for risk for fairness metrics off the bat. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to optimize for all of them, right? That doesn't work. You actually, there's an impossibility theorem that states that no more than one of these three metrics can be optimized at the same time. So there's trade-offs that have to be made. You need to have a consensus across diverse stakeholders, and then you have to have an auditability trail of that, and then be able to monitor that you've hit that target over time. So to summarize all of that, I know I started with training and then I kind of got into components and definitions and nuance. But to summarize all of it, the biggest training is that this isn't just something you can fully automate at scale, but how you start to minimize that translation gap between the experts in oversight and your technology committee is really key, especially as these more use cases are made. More cases are being made against organizations for things like misleading claims.
Those are some really great points. I think that I take from this that, that balancing act between what's possible and what's necessary is a big one. And the fact that you mentioned training actually leads me to wanting to ask you a follow-up question. We discussed this as we were preparing for this panel session, but AI literacy and training is something that a lot of our members also ask us about, right? Especially with requirements entering into force now in the EU AI Act. The question is, hey, okay, so what does AI literacy mean practically? And what are you guys seeing across the board? There's very little guidance right now or practical guidance on what to actually do. And so I'm curious to know, this really question to all three of you, if you'd be able to touch a little bit more on that component and speak to your own experience with what are you seeing and what would you add as like quick win or a recommendation in terms of how to approach AI literacy and training.
I am happy to jump in if that's cool with the other panelists. And I know,
Good, Mike.
Bilva, you haven't had a chance to jump in yet. I can say briefly, we have stood up a literacy training that will launch in February to comply with the EU AI Act and at BCG, and we've basically had to build that ourselves. There was no formal guidance from Europe yet as to what that should look like. They simply said something like tailored to your organization and the scope and use cases that you typically see, something to that effect. So we basically stepped back and said, how do we make sure that everyone at BCG understands what is AI, like what is an AI system? Basic understanding, not too deep, right? What is an AI system? How do I know whether I'm using one in my work at BCG, right? What are the typical use cases that we see at BCG? And then what are the risks that those typical use cases present? And where do we go at BCG when we've identified a potential area of risk, right? Who do we contact to set in motion the relevant review processes, et cetera? So that's the approach that we took. So basic understanding, identify the risks, where to go to help mitigate those risks, and the support structures that are in place. And we are seriously hoping that that is sufficient to meet the EU's vague requirement for literacy.
What about you, Bex or Bilva? Have you got any thoughts on the AI literacy requirements? I know, Bex, you just gave the whole explanation of your thoughts there, but anything you would like to add?
I think the only other thing I'll add is that we've seen this challenge come up across our customers. So as we started to build out training materials for use of our own solutions, we had to take a step back and even provide some basic professional background training for our customers. So it wasn't even just hands-on keyboard, it was more why this tool exists in the first place, which I think was kind of back to the GDPR days where we were starting to educate our customers on just what the nuance of the law was. So it just really feels like the early days again.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned around, I guess the context being key here and use cases, as you just mentioned, Michael, that's like something these pieces of legislation and regulation in general tend to refer back to, right? Take a look at your own use cases, build a use case registry, figure out like, what are you actually working with? Plays a really important role. And so that leads me to ask you, Bilva, I know that we're seeing a lot of different, both realistic and somewhat hypothetical use cases, appearing both in mainstream media that we hear about, but also in practice. Are you maybe able to tell us a little bit more, or I guess distinguish between fact and fiction in terms of what are we seeing and how safety and trustworthiness play into that at this point in time?
Yes, definitely. So I know there's a lot of debates in the AI safety space about which risk area, which capability, what type of models should be of the most concern. Everyone kind of has an opinion on that. I'm not here to be judge, jury, executioner of which opinion is right or wrong, but I think it's really important to see what current trends are with respect to ethics and safety, and try to see what the projections of those could look like in a future with more advanced AI systems. I think that's a pragmatic way to look at it. In terms of my experience, what I've seen quite a bit of, primarily focused on the safety side of things, both within companies and then on the outside in the US government. There's three areas that I would put at the top of my list as areas for concern. The first one is child safety and exploitation, and just broadly the area of like non-consensual intimate imagery or content. The second area is over reliance on AI systems. We primarily see this from the perspective of chatbots. So this could have to do with anything between medical use cases and being far too reliant on outputs from chatbots to what we're seeing with, quite frankly, AI girlfriends, AI friends, and how that may be affecting someone's psyche, how they view the world, and overdependence on entities that are not real. So anthropomorphization. And then the last piece I want to highlight is the acceleration of abuse vectors that have already existed widely in internet ecosystems, that we're just seeing get far worse as a result of the deployment of different AI technologies and tools. Primarily, I'm thinking of issues in the information ecosystem. So that could have to do with just broadly spam. I know there's a lot of focus on misinformation or disinformation from specific foreign actors, but quite frankly, the highest volume of issues are really in the spam space, in the financial frauds, scams. Not that it's not an issue for misinformation as well, or for more coordinated influence operations, but in terms of volume and scale, you're really seeing that a lot in spam. And then just broadly, like being able to interpret what is the origin of the content that you're interacting with and whether you should trust it or not is a better way to frame that situation. So I would highlight these three areas that I am the most concerned about. To dive a little bit deeper, I think specifically into child safety a bit more. This is something that I worked on when I was at OpenAI and when I was at the US AI Safety Institute. And a problem here is that as models get more and more multimodal, so as we transcend text and we operate in video, audio domains with images, and you're able to do a variety of different multimodal inputs and then also get multimodal outputs, the abuse vectors for those types of models also accelerates, right? It's very difficult to build safety classifiers or multimodal machine learning safety classifiers, I should say, as models get more advanced and be able to catch every single abuse use case, just because the context can be really hard to decipher in those situations. And so I'm really concerned about that, particularly with video generation and child safety. This has already been an issue. There's all sorts of tools that exist out there in which you can non-consensually remove the clothes of a person in an image. We're seeing that happen in schools with children as well, that this is where the literacy piece actually that we were talking about before really matters, given that this is happening at scale between children, not just, adults doing this to images of children. And so there's a massive problem there. And child sexual abuse material, unfortunately, is not a new problem, but we're just seeing a lot of acceleration with the deployment of AI tools. And there's some legitimately malicious models and platforms actually that still exist, in which the delivery of this content can be streamlined. So personally, I think that the child safety stuff to me is of the utmost urgency, particularly because there are legal regulations that cover that piece from the perspective of computer generated imagery within the United States, and I believe abroad as well. So to me, that seems like the most obvious safety problem. And then long term, I'm really concerned about over reliance, information ecosystem pollution, which we're already seeing right now. Yeah. So those are the three things that I'm personally very focused on. I think in terms of the theoretical items, there's lots of different point of views here. I think what I would suggest to this audience is to really think about capabilities and how capabilities can translate into different harm use cases, right? So if you have a model that gets way better at a variety of different cyber related tasks, then you can imagine how that can be used in an abuse context. So trying to think about it more with the capabilities point of view, that we start to get into some theoretical territory there as well.
I think these are really interesting point and very big problems and very big concerns. Not, something that you obviously can address with, just a checklist or anything as simple as that. I'm curious to know though, for those situations in which these challenges appear, these concerns arise within a specific context, within a specific organization, that maturity scale is, goes from it spans across a lot of different, I guess, places in which organizations find themselves right now. Where do you start this conversation? Looking at the rapid pace at which challenges like these are evolving. Secondly, the fact that those regulatory developments are also continuing in all three, I guess, domains or specific areas that you just mentioned. And for those organizations at different levels of maturity, how do they, at least start this conversation or move forward in trying to address some of these challenges? Do you have any thoughts on that, Bilva?
Yes, definitely. And I think it can be hard, right? Like why should an organization that's about to deploy a chatbot for the first time that's working on a very narrow use case um, care about child safety implementations when their product is not for children? Nothing that they do is related to child safety.
Yeah.
You have to be able to translate the harms that can occur when you're using general purpose systems, even for narrow use cases, because there is the potential for abuse, especially as you have end users interacting with the systems in ways where you may not be able to track them in the same way as a first party user, right? So I think translating that can be really hard. I think a way to frame it though is focusing on the use case and the context, if that makes sense. So if you're interacting or using a model, if you have a model integrated into your system in which you can have image inputs, well, as a company legally, you probably don't want to be in the possession of child sexual abuse material, even accidentally, on your servers, right? As soon as you introduce image to the equation, you introduce the possibility, unfortunately, of child sexual abuse material or just the ability to even just have like nude images or images that you just don't want there. And so in order to cover liability, but also an interest to use the tool for its intended purpose, which is not for child sexual abuse material, one would hope, you want the functionality to protect against that. You want to have machine learning classifiers that will prevent the upload of those images into your system, right? I think that there's a really easy way to make those cases when you focus on the really high risk areas and you can tie it to things like liability, and also you can tie it to the user experience. you don't want your chatbots hallucinating or creating confabulations that are harmful or that are not satisfying the intended purpose of a product. And so I think all of these things help, right, to bridge the gap between something that seems so vast and perhaps disconnected, like child safety, to a company's intended use case, which may have nothing to do with child safety. But I think it's a responsibility to kind of build the bridge between those two areas and really show how things like child safety could be a liability. I think with over reliance as a specific domain, it can be a little bit more difficult because the research there is still growing. We still don't know exactly how frequent interaction with chatbots is affecting people, though there are some negative use cases, some very unfortunate use cases that have been in the news recently. So I think just bringing those specific case studies to the company's consciousness, trying to understand what kind of guardrails can be put in place, and then just also resulting once again in a more positive user experience. If the product is supposed to be for a very specific business use case, you don't want it to turn into someone's personal diary, right? And then you to have hold all this information that you probably don't want about the person. So it really depends on what the company or entity is trying to achieve, what the intended use case is, and then based on those use cases, how do you bridge the gap to all of these like safety issues that are the most high risk? And there might be some safety issues that are more high risk to a specific entity. For example, insurance companies might be really worried about scams, right? They don't want any sort of scam related content or any scam use cases. And so that you can bring to their attention immediately. So it's kind of about identifying the use case for specific clients, I think, and then also for the things that are hard and fast no's, like child exploitation, how do you build a bridge to understanding there?
It's absolutely fascinating. Michael, I want to direct the next question to you just based off of what Bilva is saying. I know that you have a lot of experience with this development cycle internally within BCG and the work that you're focusing on in different use cases as well. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on what that means practically, looking at your own work, looking at these use cases, integrating these controls, and what your experience has been with this. So,
Yeah, thanks, Hadassah. Absolutely. So I could describe basically how we operationalize our AI at BCG. So we start with, and I'm hoping there's significant overlap with what others are doing in the industry as well. So we start with overarching RAI principles and company values as our kind of bedrock or foundation. And from there, we've created an RAI policy. And the RAI policy sets the sort of basic standards, the basic governance processes, and our risk taxonomy of use cases, which we've built intentionally in light of the EU AI Act risk taxonomy, though ours includes more. We're extra cautious. And we've stood up a dedicated team comprised of folks across legal, risk and compliance, responsible AI, InfoSec, data privacy, engineering, data science. We have a team dedicated essentially to reviewing each and every proposal for work that has an AI component in it to check that against the risk taxonomy that we have. And if we identify a high risk use case according to our taxonomy, then we have a further deep dive, as it were, review of that proposed work where we engage a council of experts. The council of experts includes people across industry practice areas, across backgrounds, external experts as well. We convene weekly and we review these high risk area cases. My team puts together the initial assessment of the risks, initial assessment of the mitigation plan. We get input on that from the council and we share that back with the team putting together the proposal. And when the proposal is sort of sold, right, and won, and BCG then partners with their client to build the AI system in question, we take that preliminary documentation, and now we sit down with the data scientists, the engineers, who are partnering with the client to actually start building the AI system itself. And there, again, we make sure that the risks we've identified are accurate. Often projects change in subtle ways over time, so we make sure that the mitigations are in place, that the mitigations are actually working to generate the sort of safer outcomes that we want. And around all of this, we have AI literacy, we have upskilling across the company, we have tools to support testing and evaluation. Our team conducts systematic testing and evaluation of high-risk Gen AI systems that we're going to deploy, so red teaming, as we now call it. So we include that in what we do when we're actually helping build and deliver the software. And then finally, when it comes time to partner with and hand over to the client, right, with whom we're building this AI system, we have responsible AI documentation that we include. So in the industry, those are sometimes called AI system cards. Microsoft calls them transparency notes, right? Documentation of that sort to create and to sustain what the EU AI Act is calling the post-market monitoring of these systems, right? So now that the client takes ownership of it, they have to be able to do so responsibly. So we enable them when they take ownership of the AI system to do so responsibly. So that's how we see it. That's how we've done it. We partner with product teams, as it were. We live in that world. We don't live in the compliance world, though of course we partner with our compliance experts to make sure that we're bringing all of the right expertise and information to bear on each and every high-risk case that we see. So it's quite an amazing process. And I think, and I'm hoping it aligns with emerging industry best practices across the globe as more and more organizations are standing up similar RAI programs.
That sounds really great. You're really the translating force between these teams. That's what it sounds like to me, alongside responsible AI work that you do. You mentioned documentation. I think that's a topic that we keep ourselves busy with quite a lot as well. It's a complicated topic, given that it's what you need in order to be able to understand the assess risk, understand what controls to put in place, what has already been done. But documentation isn't always as available or as standardized as I guess one would want to see. What would your, I guess, best practices or thoughts be around creating standardized documentation? Where should this start? Who, I guess, should have ownership over creating a documentation and keeping intact that audit trail? We see this a lot in the assessment work that we do, for instance, at the Responsible AI Institute, right? It's never the same picture. So how has that been looking like for you?
So ideally for me, I would prefer that basically the large companies that are building the LLMs, they themselves provide standardized documentation about the models themselves, right? So OpenAI, for example, does share system cards. I believe they use that nomenclature publicly when they launch new features, let's say. So that standardized documentation across industries and across the providers of these large language models, disclosing how the models have been trained, disclosing the limitations that they've uncovered, discussing the mitigations that they've put in. That kind of standardized picture is essential for people such as BCG, who takes those models and then builds something with them with a client, right? So we need to understand what are the risks that we take on board using a product built by, let's say, OpenAI, right? We need to understand that so then our downstream client can themselves understand what their risks they're inheriting from that system, from that LLM. So I would personally think it would be excellent industry-wide if there were standards for that kind of disclosure from the model providers themselves across the industry. That would be excellent and make my job tremendously easier if there was some uniformity in that documentation.
Absolutely feel you. Bex, I want to drive the next question to you. We're talking about documentation here. All of this essentially stems from higher level principles, right? We're looking to increase safety, we're looking to increase fairness, reduce bias, ensure privacy and data protection, etc. Translating those principles into practice is being done through a wide range of regulations, legislation. The EU AI Act is an example, but as we've already discussed during this session, actual implementation isn't always as clear, and guidance is to some extent lacking. Just looking at, I guess, the product perspective that you have working at an AI governance platform, building out that platform to support organizations, large and small. What does that look like, this practical implementation of principle to practice? And what is that, I guess, user journey when, working towards that?
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of talk about the journey that our customers have been on. And Michael really kind of set the stage. I think a lot of what BCG is doing is kind of reflective across what we're seeing across our client base. Many customers started with their existing PIA and ROPA inventory because they had that on hand as a way to start conducting that gap analysis, understanding what AI was out there by adding like a simple question, yes, no, for the presence of AI, so that they could start to build that punch list of what required for further scrutiny against the different principles that you laid out. Next was building out different impact assessments, layering in AI-specific questions. We've built out a one AI template at OneTrust that takes nuances from the EU AI Act, ISO, and NIST, and sort of creates this really high bar across all of them. Now, that's a really comprehensive set of questions and framework from those different frameworks. So we pare it back. I think the next thing that we've seen a lot of customers adopt is an intake process, where they have a lightweight questionnaire that just sort of gets the ball rolling, gets a baseline understanding of what that risk looks like, identifying the inputs, the models, so that the committee can just give a go, no go. Like, there are going to be use cases that are just outside of an organization's risk tolerance. So let's not devote resources to working with the team to even mitigate the risks that we uncovered. We'll also see sort of this establishment of like a fast lane where there's something that is a low risk use case. Perhaps it's a model that has been whitelisted or an application that we've already evaluated. We'll allow that to sort of proceed with guardrails, so that really we'll see teams focusing on that middle layer of risk where there's uncharted territory. The value is there from a business standpoint that those teams want to dive in, double click in further. So that's sort of the strategy around establishing an intake process, really like a front door for all new AI initiatives. I mentioned the whitelist, blacklist strategy. So technology that is just outright banned. We'll see, network firewalls being used to block URLs for, applications that are just not acceptable to use, as well as whitelisting, so having a short list of applications to recommend to employees or models to build upon that have maybe the right contractual clauses built into those agreements. More mature customers are starting to integrate their environments, so getting full visibility into the technological components within their MLOps tools, pulling that visibility in. We're also seeing organizations mature their data strategy in 3 specific areas. So on the data ingestion side, to Bilva's point around these multimodal models becoming more sophisticated, really, 90% of organizations' data is stored in unstructured data formats. And so this allows organizations to tap into that asset and presents a massive opportunity. It's one of the things that generative AI does so well, is make sense of unstructured inputs. So organizations are adapting their infrastructure by building unstructured data pipelines that can help cleanse and parse the raw data, using those classifiers to identify sensitive inputs that should not make their way into company assets, and making sure that the information that is ingested is tagged and labeled with metadata for context and structure, and then creating a reusable format to make it easily accessible for the AI systems, so that they can be transformed into high quality inputs. The other area we'll see a lot of a focus and evolution is around enhancing metadata for responsible AI. So the data to interpret the data to deliver more accurate results, tagging and labeling data to ensure that you have consistency. There's no false positives, there's no null values. Understanding, is this date that I have on my transaction the purchase date, or is it the travel date if I'm an airline supplier? Like, depending on what date that is, there's certain rules that are going to apply, and implications for the models that we're going to run against that data. And then tracking lineage to make sure that we have visibility into its origin, its processing, to support both the compliance side as well as the troubleshooting for when something goes wrong. So that really ensures that we can support both the responsible principles and ensure that stronger outcomes and outputs for those models. And then the last area that I see a lot of evolution within the data environment is within sharing. So we're sharing information with third parties with these models. Data goes in, but it doesn't come out, right? So we need to make sure that we're addressing that with our infrastructure to have a more trusted data sharing platform. So we see things like granular access controls to restrict access to privileged and non-privileged users, for things like sensitive inputs, right? Like I'm going to expose several different columns within a database, but maybe I'm not going to expose something like social security number. I don't need that in order to train the input. Perhaps I might expose something like race to someone who's performing a fairness analysis, but I'm not going to expose it to the end user who could potentially extract that information out. So making sure that we're aligning with those different ethical frameworks and focusing on that accountability and transparency for the data that is being fed into those pipelines, really to ensure that security and compliance upfront.
That's super interesting. Thanks for those key points across all maturity levels, Bex. That's really helpful. An item that or a point that it at least pops up in my mind relates to transparency both below the surface and above the surface. And I know, Bill, you've been working a lot around transparency, data provenance, synthetic data. I think it connects very well with what Bex was just saying, and I'd be curious to hear more about some of the practical mechanisms and ways of working that you take with you and that your experience shows around how can you be transparent in a practical way, both below and above that surface level.
Definitely. I'll caveat this with transparency is perhaps an overused word in the AI space and means different things to different people. But with respect to what I'll talk about, I'll focus a lot on the origin of either data or content as it turns into an AI output, which is what I spent the majority of my time working on when I was on the US AI Safety Institute in the synthetic content portfolio. So similar to what Michael and Bex have been talking about, kind of what we've all been talking about in this panel quite a bit is thinking about like a risk-based approach to implementation and what you need for different contexts. Though there are some universal practices, some of which are laid out actually in NIST's most recent generative AI profile, which came out last year, a little bit later last year. But there are some specific transparency practices that you can adopt universally across organizations. I think to start, figuring out where your training data is from and actually documenting its origin in a meaningful way. This seems very baseline, but has been a problem for many different organizations and a challenge too, right? Especially when an org is using a base model that may be from a company, but then they're fine-tuning it on their own data. So there's a lack of transparency perhaps as to, what kind of data they're ingesting from the base model. And even internally, there might be a lack of transparency about, well, what training data was used for fine-tuning internally and which team has access to that data and who doesn't have access and why did we choose to make those decisions to include the specific type of data in the first place? So I think starting from data provenance, I'm thinking of it more as a life cycle, right? So starting from data provenance, actually distinguishing where your data is from, because that can help delineate if there's problems in the future in outputs, or if you have harmful outputs. Starting off with where the data is from can be very helpful to figure out how you ended up with a harmful output. I keep going back to child safety, but this is like a very good way to start thinking about child safety use cases and ensuring that your data is filtering out content that you just don't want to see in your outputs, such as nudity content, for example, or CSAM, or anything else that may not be pertinent to your use case or useful. And then as you go down the pipeline, right, you can see transparency manifest in different ways. A huge problem right now is figuring out the origin and history of content or behavior on the internet. This is not really a new problem for a variety of reasons, right? The way the internet was designed, the way platforms are designed, generally to preserve privacy, anonymity, all of which makes sense. But then the use cases where individuals are trying to figure out, well, what content should I trust? Or how do I know that the BBC actually made this post on LinkedIn, or whether it's a fake account or not? Then you start to get into some problems with transparency and origin in particular. And so what I spent a lot of my time working on is how do you do an effective provenance implementation, whether that's cryptographically attached metadata. Many of you may be familiar with the C2PA specification that's been used for cryptographically attached metadata led by Adobe and Microsoft. It could also be an imperceptible embedded watermark. I know the word watermark has been very popular these days, both in federal legislation, but as well as the EU AI Act. And all of these are options However, implementing them comes with a whole host of challenges, right? So even for the defined problems that you're trying to solve with defined solutions, there are implementation challenges, either on the technical side, they could be adoption or scale related, they could be very tied to just humans and like how well do these implementations work in practice. So I'll give you an example. I think that there's been, going back to watermarking, a lot of different entities are advocating watermarking. I think it makes a lot of sense. There's some pre-existing watermarks that have been standardized, but for other industries, I believe like broadcast is one of them, which is quite interesting. But the implementation of a watermark in content and actually having that scale across different platforms is quite difficult, right? You need to be able to cryptographically embed a watermark into the content. It ideally shouldn't distort the quality of the content. And then that watermark is supposed to seamlessly travel with the content across the internet. And then if a specific platform, like a social media platform, wants to inform their users that, hey, there's a watermark in this content designating that its origin is from this model, then that platform has to be able to read the watermark and be able to decipher the watermark within posts or within feeds, right? And so there's so many different layers of complexity there. So slapping a watermark onto something, it's not as easy as it sounds, and that's where you see a lot of the trickiness with implementation, right? Everyone wants transparency, but when does transparency become a threat to privacy? What if there's a watermark in content that I created, and I only want it to be available to a certain group of people? However, because a watermark is cryptographically embedded, it's a pretty strong watermark. That's terminology that's used in the technical community. Then the watermark is traveling with the content. I actually don't know where it's going to end up. What if data brokers are using watermarking information about my content without my consent? How do I even know that's happening? These are all problems that have occurred in various different domains, but you're starting to see them materialize, I think, in AI context. And so I think that transparency obviously is a goal. It is a long-term process. It can really depend on what you mean when you say transparency across different contexts, but it is not very easy to implement and it's not universal. And so there's a lot of thinking that has to be done, a lot of trade-offs that are to be made, specifically with things like provenance, where you're dealing with privacy trade-offs, network effects issues. Sometimes it's not really useful until there's widespread adoption. But there isn't widespread adoption because of the technical issues. And then you're seeing a cyclical kind of self-fulfilling prophecy there. And then the last part that I really want to touch on with this specific use case and issue is, how do you know if it's actually useful? Like when you have a watermark in content saying that it's AI generated, what does that mean to the user? Will the user trust the content less? Will they like the fact that they're able to delineate that this content came from a specific model? Is it meaningful to them at all? Will it accidentally erode trust in content that's supposed to be trustworthy because it has a marker in it? There's some initial studies and sociotechnical studies that have been done, but there's a lot more research that is yet to happen. And so you're seeing a lot of trickiness, right? All the way from the inception of where does my training data come from to all the way to the end of an AI generated output. Where is my content coming from? Who should care? And what are the use cases to care, and how well things are working? So it's a mixed bag, but I don't want this to come off as like I'm saying transparency isn't important, but it's incredibly important, if not some of the most important things when you're thinking about responsible AI implementation. I think you really need to think about what are the trade-offs in order to get transparency right, and who is the transparency for? I think is a really important question as well.
Absolutely. They are definitely very important questions. I think that's my personal opinion, that regulation has like a very important role to play there. It can, on the one hand, it has the ability to make things more clear, and that the EU will be coming out with a standard focused on transparency in particular, based on the transparency requirements it sets. Whether or not those are comprehensive enough, I think, is a discussion we can have at another point in time. But that's one way that they are looking at it. At the same time, there is this issue with over-regulation, right? And the fragmentation across different requirements that we're seeing. The EU is just one example where those trade-offs, I guess, are already being seen. How do you act upon those? How do you balance them? In the US, we're seeing that over the past year, there has been a lot of effort towards regulating AI in some way or another, not necessarily legislation at the federal level, at the state level. We've been seeing that a lot more. We're going into 2025, or we are in 2025 right now. I think this week has shown us a lot in terms of where we are, at least right now, where we'll be heading. I think only time will tell, but I'm very curious to know, Michael, from you. We're seeing to some extent an absence of federal regulation on AI. Again, we're not sure exactly where this will be heading, moving on in this year, but I'm curious to know from you what organizations can rely on in the absence of any federal action, and that fragmented approach right across states and externally international frameworks. What can they rely on to create trustworthy AI? And do we need any of these centralized frameworks to do so successfully?
Those are great questions. I will take the second one first. I think as a matter of human, I guess human beings, I think like to have clear frameworks, clear answers, yes and no. It gives them a guidance, it gives them a sense of control. So in short, do we need formal frameworks? I think they are a crucial element of generating trust among human beings, just as a matter of how we're motivated. So it is absolutely essential that we, for example, look to the EU AI Act. So yes, we are going to see the US step aside, as it were, in providing formal frameworks, but we can and should look to the EU and to other places that have legislation on the books around the globe, especially for companies that are operating globally. And in the States, as you mentioned, where I sit now in Colorado, for example, there is an AI law. So we will see and continue to see states pushing legislation. The challenge will be harmonization across the different legislative the languages and the requirements. But still, I think we will see these formal frameworks emerging in patchwork across the globe. And I think they're absolutely necessary for building trust. I think about regular automobiles, not autonomous cars. But when I get in my car and drive this vehicle, I trust that it's safe. And the reason, in part, why I trust that it's safe is because there are formal frameworks governing the automobile industry and the safety standards and the testing and evaluation of automobiles. I find that a useful analogy for AI systems. It will build those kinds of formal frameworks, definitely build trust among the people actually using the AI systems deployed in the world now as we speak.
And Bex, maybe moving to you in terms of creating some sort of an accountability chain, right? Those frameworks are very important. And they lay the basis. What happens in practice may be aligned with that, may look a little bit different, again, in the absence of any centralized frameworks or at least any standardized frameworks. Because even if we do look at, these bigger pieces, there's still some level of difference between them. What are organizations doing practically to create that accountability chain? What have you been seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think step one in any risk-based approach, you need to know what you're managing. So having a system of record is the first place to start. This requires, we've talked about like the nuance of the different use cases. We've talked about the technological components, the data inputs, the models themselves. You might have a project management tool in your organization where you're managing projects and new initiatives that's disconnected from your data estate where you're managing data, that's disconnected from your developer environments where you're developing, testing, and deploying models. So I think bringing and unifying those pieces together is one of the key pieces so that you can actually have like that system of record that allows you to assess the risk, take that risk-based approach, identify the different steps that you're going to do, the controls that need to be put in place, and really manage and accept that risk. So that's sort of the first place to start. Is building that system of record, and that also serves as sort of the engine where, to build on this car analogy, right? Like the seatbelt allows me to go fast. Having this system of record in place, having processes in place, having a formalized intake process, having a slow, fast, and medium lane for low, medium, high risk allows us to stay on track with our goals and initiatives as a business.
Thank you so much. I know that we're slowly but surely running out of time, so I want to ask all three of you one final question, circling back to what you said at the start about this being your favorite job. Or the best job, I guess, out there. Do each of you maybe want to touch upon, well, I know that we talk a lot about risk, right? And we talk a lot about the challenges, but I think focusing on some of the exciting and good things ahead is also nice, maybe to close up this session. So would you like to focus on something that you're looking forward to in, starting 2025? What are you excited about in the responsible AI space? And we can close it there. Maybe starting with you, Bilda.
The tough question to answer first. There's a lot. I mean, I think what I am really excited about is starting to see like applications really proliferate. I think the year of general purpose AI models was kind of last year. Not to say that they're not important in this coming year, but I think there's quickly a realization that specific use case focused applications or fine-tuning models for specific cases, or even using smaller models in order to ensure more trustworthy deployments. I think that's where a lot of the attention has been. And so I'm really excited to see those kind of grow and to develop like responsible AI frameworks for actual operational use cases for things that we can control. In terms of the slightly more scary pieces, but also exciting pieces that we may not have as good of a handle on, I would say just kind of I believe that this is the year of AI agents. Everyone is saying it, so it must be true in some shape or form. And I think just figuring out the governance of AI agents, what kinds of infrastructure we're going to need in order to enable them. I think just the putting together the foundational pieces of how do we do quote unquote responsible AI with agentic infrastructure, and what does that look like, and where should the line be between human and AI decision making, which has been a question for quite a bit, but I think that question has been exacerbated with the introduction of agents, and so I think those are the things that I'm excited about for the year.
That sounds really good. What about you, Michael?
Really quickly, because we're out of time, the theme through what I've been saying is I'm looking for clarity from the EU on exactly what we need to do to comply with the EU AI Act. Thank you very much.
Finally, Bex, I know we have a couple of seconds left.
Yeah, everybody's leaning into responsible AI. It's definitely different from the days of GDPR where everybody was running away from it. And I think that's just because the technology is so new and people just want to get it right from the initial adoption point. Whereas with the privacy laws, it was imposing requirements on things that we had been doing for such a long time. So it's just exciting to be working with so many people leaning into something like governance.
Absolutely. Well, thank all of you very, very much for joining me on this panel session. Thanks to the attendees for listening in. I hope this was a valuable discussion to you. And with that, I think we will close this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.